Hello, Record Live family. We have one of the family, Jesse, Pastor Jesse Herford, is joining us again. Jesse, we've had you on a few times, but we appreciate you. It's good to have you willing to step in. As you may have noticed now, Zanita, my regular co host, is unable to join us this week. And so it's good to have Jesse stepping into the void. So thanks, Jesse.
Great to be here. You can't get rid of me even if you try, Jared.
Jesse, today's conversation is an interesting one. Now, we put we always put a descriptor of each episode, and in the descriptor of this, it's like, is empathy a sin? It might be an obvious question. It might be like, well, of course not. No. And yet there is a social movement at the moment. There are books being written, there are social commentators picking up this theme that perhaps empathy is the root of all of our problems. You wrote a Science article called Is Empathy Killing the West on that very theme. And we thought, yeah, great for science, for them to have all the fun over there, but let's bring you on Record Live and let's get to the bottom of this topic because it does have practical implications for us as Christians. So, first
Yeah.
of all, oh,
No, couldn't agree
after
with you
you,
more.
first of all, I thought we would define empathy. According to the internet, the source of all wisdom, empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another.
Hmm.
To understand and share the feelings of another. That's at its very basic level, the definition of empathy. How, why would anyone have a problem with someone being able to understand the feelings of someone else?
Yeah, this is really the core of this, I think, came about around the time when President Donald Trump began his second term. There is a now infamous moment where he is attending an Easter, not an Easter, a Sunday service at the church closest to the White House. It's where typically a lot of presidents have gone to church when the time comes for it. And the Bishop Buddy, made an appeal directly to the president and to his, I guess, inner circle to show empathy, to show compassion to those in America who were feeling afraid, who were feeling vulnerable, and of course, there was a lot of discourse around this request. Very little else of the sermon was actually spoken about. It was really this moment of an appeal for empathy, an appeal for compassion, and it's not that this was kind of the start, but this was, I think, kind of the moment in the cultural discourse where the idea of empathy actually being a bad thing entered the public conversation. And
So,
the
so,
root of
so
it,
the interaction there popularized an
I'd
idea
say
that
so.
was already, because I remember that sort of moment that wasn't that long ago, and yet in your article you reference at least three books all on this very specific topic. Surely they were in the works or even released before this moment, but
Yeah.
you're saying that really was the tipping point that pushed it into the cultural awareness.
Two of the three books, I believe, were published before this moment. One of them is only just released, so perhaps it was influenced, perhaps not. The publication process is long. Uh, but it's definitely, I think it was kind of like a match lighting a tinderbox that was already there. To be very clear, the the conversation under the conversation, I think, and we're probably going to come back to this a lot. It's a lot of culture war stuff, and we are living in a cultural moment where culture war issues are the ones that a lot of people are the hills upon which people are trying to die. So, immigration, abortion, the role of women in society, these are all obviously very hotly contested topics. And they all kind of find their unifying factor in this idea of empathy. And in a very unexpected way, I would say it. I wouldn't have, if you'd asked me a few years ago if this was going to be the thing that we were going to talk about, I wouldn't have expected that. But here we are.
Can you can you give us a sense as to how those things are linked? Because the things you've mentioned aren't necessarily obvious in my mind to this point, you know. So maybe just lay some groundwork for us, the basis of the concept that is being touted. Now, you know, clearly from your piece you disagree that empathy is a sin. We're not
Sure.
necessarily taking that side, but what are the commentators who are putting forth this idea, what are they saying in a nutshell?
Yeah. Well, I'll quote and I'll paraphrase just to for the sake of time. So uh, these are two of these are evangelical conservatives. Just to sort of place where this is coming from. One of them is Ali Beth Stuckey. She says in her book Toxic Empathy: How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion. Toxic empathy pushes us to not only have compassion for someone's difficulties, but to unquestioningly affirm their feelings because if we were in their shoes, we'd want our feelings to be affirmed. So her argument is basically it's kind of, you hear this a lot in churches, the whole, affirming emotions, anything goes, live your truth kind of sort of thing. Her issue is that, or her assertion, I suppose you could say, is that this is actually making its way into public policy. So, governments signing laws that affirm people's emotions rather than the quote unquote capital T truth. Um, she goes on to say in her book, when they call you hateful, bigoted, racist, or any other epithet, it usually means they don't know why they believe what they believe. So their insecurity manifests itself in anger. Um, pretty harsh sort of words, but that's, I guess, that's kind of where this is coming from. And each of these books that I mentioned in the article kind of come it from a different angle, but they all kind of have their root in this idea that empathy, when it goes to its most logical conclusion, will make us side with people not because we believe their viewpoint or what they say or what they stand for, but because we feel an emotional connection to them. And so it causes us to betray our own principles, what we should stand for.
Mm. So it's kind of like the whole nice Jesus caricature, you know, turn the other cheek, don't stand for anything. Is it just a step in for permissiveness? Is that really what they're sort of arguing? Instead of actually empathy, they're suggesting that people are just permissive on things that they disagree with because they feel like they wouldn't want someone to tell them what to do. So don't tell me what to do, sort of thing.
I think that's part of it, definitely. Um, I think it's about, I think it's fundamentally about what you believe and the way that manifests in how you live your life. I think there's also kind of a undertone of kind of macho, like anti macho weakness in there. Um, Christianity, in particular, in the United States, has become a faith that is much more embraced by men, young men in particular, are flocking to Christianity. But it's interesting to note that women who have been, historically the largest represented gender in Christianity are leaving Christianity. So it's an interesting uh, kind of dichotomy. And the other author I mentioned, Joe Rigney, he's an evangelical minister. He talks about this, how empathy is kind of, it's feminizing because and this, look, I'll say up straight up, I think it's an incredibly sexist take that he's going on, but he talks about how empathy, because it feminizes the church, it feminizes our leadership structures, and he kind of warns that it could ultimately feminize our institutions and, you know, our nations. So that's, you know, it's a pretty harsh take again, but that's what he's putting forth, his contribution toward the empathy argument.
So potentially coming from the why men hate church sort of, and the macho sort of alpha Jesus idea of Christianity, sort of building up Christianity to be some sort of masculine, aggressive religion. Is that these things are linked? Is what you're saying? That this movement is growing out of
Yeah.
some of that background. It's some of the similar ideas in the undertones, and then they've sort of talked about that. What is the difference between compassion then in this sort of commentary? Because one of the books you mentioned, Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion. What do they
Mm.
see as the difference between empathy and compassion? Because I think, yeah, to understand, to argue these terms or to understand what they're actually saying, we need to understand how they're splitting hairs. Is it just semantics? Are they just using different words to describe different things than we might think of when we hear those words?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that one because Paul Bloom is the only non-Christian in this list of authors that I mentioned. He is a secular humanist, I believe. Um, I think you could probably say it's semantics, but I think they would say the difference is in attachment or detachment. So they would, I think, say empathy is about putting yourselves in the shoes of another, so much so that you feel what they feel, you experience what they experience, and so you end up wanting what they want, even if it's counter what you want or what's good for you. I would say, I think they would say compassion is seeing the plight, perhaps, of another person, but being detached enough to be able to still feel your own feelings, to be able to prioritize yourself and the interests of you and perhaps your in group, um, while still having a measure of emotion being stirred in some way toward the cause of somebody else. Probably that's what they would say.
It's interesting because you have to be fairly, it seems like they're coming from a perspective of being very well off, um you know, not struggling with the things. You can be compassionate downwards, um in a sense,
It
rather than
does,
being empathetic upwards,
yeah.
sideways, roundabout.
It does seem a little condescending. I mean, if you're the person coming at from a place of privilege, and of course, I mean, even me saying somebody coming at it from a place of privilege is probably, some people wouldn't like me even using those terms. But when we think of the place that we hold in society, you know, for me to refuse to empathize with somebody who has less than me, who doesn't have my shared experience, who has a different color of skin, perhaps, or whatever, um, yeah, there is a level to it that's kind of, it's still maintaining I'm a bit better than you or whatever. I'm sure that probably somebody would be offended to characterize them that way, but I do feel like that's sort of, there's a part of that at play.
Is this just the old Christian argument of sort of evangelism versus social justice? Like, is this repainted those battlefronts in a different space? Like, you know, there's been debate, I guess, in the church, over should we be focusing on social justice, specifically in the Adventist church. I think especially we've got this end time message. We've got this agenda to reach the world, to go into all nations, and that's very important. And some people then argue that, well, the social justice, helping, feeding the poor, widows, orphans, etc., that's distracting us from the mission, the one special message that we've received to tell the world. Is that just this
Mm.
argument sort of rehashed, repainted? Like, hey, don't get bogged down in the feeling for other people. The poor you will always have with you, said Jesus. So, you know, stay on task, stay on mission.
It's an interesting question. I don't know if I've thought about it in those terms. I I would definitely I can definitely see where that's coming from. It makes me think of when the early church, the attractionalness of the early church was not necessarily in their message. I mean, of course, there was a certain amount of the message of Jesus that was powerful, but the early church was persecuted because of their message, because the message of the gospel and the message of Jesus was so offensive to a polytheistic, Hellenized world. But the thing that the early church did that I think, from what I've read, was so attractive was was their social justice, was the way that they cared for the poor, the way that they took care of orphans, the way they adopted,
Mm.
the babies that were thrown out, widows, and the radical way that they treated rich and slave and in between all the same. So I think maybe we've forgotten about that a little bit. Uh, and
In some
I
ways, that was the message, and the methods were also
correct.
offensive. The methods equalized society, so they pulled up the poor, pulled down the rich, because they were giving out things and they were sharing things in common and they were helping widows and orphans. So all of a sudden, this highly stratified society was under threat. The social norms were under threat. And in some ways, it was almost just as radical as this guy died and rose from the dead, and he's the
Yeah,
one God that we worship, as well as we're helping the widows and orphans and people you say are worth nothing. And those two pronged messages sort of offended a lot of people.
100%. Yeah, I don't think you can do that without empathy. You know, I don't think
Mm.
that you can, uh, rescue a little baby if you don't see that baby as having value, and not just see it as having value, but see the potential of who that baby can grow up to be. Or a widow that in Roman society would be classed as useless because she doesn't have a male protector, or a slave who is just a commodity. I mean, how can you uplift a person like any of those if you didn't, fundamentally, if you weren't fundamentally transformed by the Christian message of, there is no Greek, there is no Jew, there is no slave nor Greek, for you're all one in Christ. Um, that message in Galatians, and the rest of the gospel message throughout the New Testament, I think testifies powerfully to the value of each person. And you can't embrace that message, I think, without embracing empathy. I'm sorry if I'm kind of getting to the altar call already, but yeah, I think that's fundamentally true.
Preacher's gonna preach.
Yeah.
Um, so we've sort of established the platform, the arguments, I suppose. Um, we've looked at the early church. We've started to talk about that Christian. Where does this interplay with Christians and
Mm.
their contention? These commentators is that it's allowing and the title, I think the subtitle, how progressives exploit Christian compassion. It's not even
Yeah.
necessarily talking about Christian progressives. It's just a left right wing sort of thing, and they're almost
Yeah.
suggesting that people who are progressive are exploiting this Christian kindness get to get them down, to make them feel empathetic and get across agendas that they might not otherwise agree with. I guess, switching tack, you've sort of spent some time understanding their ideas, but let's go to the Bible now. Why do you think empathy is a key trait that Christians need, or why do you think that um, their arguments aren't hitting the mark for Christians?
I think for one, I don't think it's possible to read the stories of Jesus and not identify him as a person who feels empathy. Um, the Bible, to be clear, does not use the word empathy. Empathy does not enter the English vernacular until like the early 20th century, and it comes from a German word which came from a Greek word that's not used in the Bible. So
Mm,
it's
mm,
not a word that is used. It's not a concept that is, defined. But I think there's no mistaking that Jesus was empathetic, and I think probably one of the best examples of that is in the story of Lazarus's death in John chapter 11. And the most famous short passage in the Bible, the shortest passage verse in the Bible is John 11 verse 35. Jesus wept. Two
mm,
words, two simple words, basically the same in every translation of the Bible. And why did Jesus weep? Jesus doesn't weep because Lazarus dies, though it's part of it. Jesus weeps because when he finally visits Bethany to see Mary and Martha, his dear friends, the two sisters, they fall to his feet, crying, if you had been here, Lazarus, our brother wouldn't have died. It's at the emotion and the anguish that these two women are displaying their feeling. The Bible tells us that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit at their emotions. He identifies with their emotions and he joins them in expressing their
mm.
emotions. He feels their grief and he empathizes with them. Um, I think it's unmistakable. And so this is, theologians all talk about how the life of Jesus is like the true typical the true human life. Like Jesus expresses what it means to be a true human. Yes, he's God. He's also fully human. And this is, I think, a fully human moment. And so I think to deny empathy is to deny one of the fundamental aspects of what it means to be a human. Um, and it's not just this. There's also the famous parable of the sheep and the goats, um, where Jesus talks about, for those who did unto the least of these, you did it to me. And on the flip side, those who did not do it to me. So everything that we do, every action of anger, resentment, bitterness, lying, slander, evil, as well as every moment of generosity, of love, of kindness, it's as though we're doing it to Jesus, and he identifies enough with the human condition and the human soul to make that leap. Um, so
Mm.
I think it's pretty clear.
Well, even his I'm thinking of that. They suggest it's one of the earliest Christian hymns or poems in Philippians. I think he did not consider equality with God something to be retained or held onto, grasped, but lowering himself, he took the form of a servant, human likeness, and died on the cross. Now, compassion would be God sending, I don't know, lightning bolts to wipe out the enemy, take away sin, give us some handouts, feed us and make us like better, raise us up from our station, I suppose. But a very empathetic thing that Jesus did was to understand and to embody our experience. Isn't that what the whole incarnation is about? I suppose
Mm,
that's what came to mind as you were sort of defining those elements of Jesus
yeah,
actually demonstrating empathy. Like his whole mission was empathetic in a sense.
yeah. God became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That's yeah. It's massive. It's a massive part of his ministry.
What do you think some of the dangers are of shutting off that empathetic muscle, like going, oh, I'm not sure about this. I think, we should maybe be wary of being too empathetic to others. What can that look like? Do you think? And why is it dangerous to not just a person, but society and you as a Christian, your experience as a Christian?
It can The danger in shutting off our empathy module is to not be able to see every human as a human. And we need only look to the lessons of the 20th century to see what happens. So many people know about the Nuremberg trials. After World War II, the remaining Nazi leaders that are still alive, people like Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, others high up in the Nazi command were captured by the Allies and held to trial. During the Nuremberg trials, a Jewish American psychologist by the name of Gustav Gilbert,
Gilbert. Mm.
thank you, uh, interviewed, listened into conversations with some of these very high ranking Nazis, and he wrote a book called the Nuremberg Diary, which is pretty chilling. But perhaps most chilling is the decision or the conclusion he makes about the nature of evil. And I'll just quote directly from the Nuremberg Diary. He says, speaking to somebody that he's communicating with, "I told you once that I was searching for the nature of evil. I think I've come close to defining it: a lack of empathy. It's the one
Hmm.
characteristic that connects all the defendants, all these Nazis, a genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow man. Evil, I think, is the absence of empathy." I I mean, we've talked about Jesus's empathy. We've talked about, the Christian sort of ideal. I think this has got to be one of the most conclusive and just nail on the coffin as far as the argument against empathy is concerned. For people who need to kind of, you know, piece together the jigsaw pieces, the reason the Nazis were so successful in eradicating 6 million Jews, Slavs, um, gay people, black people, disabled people, was because they were able to convince the German people that these other groups were not truly human. They dehumanized the Jews, they dehumanized these minority groups to the point where the average German would not see them as a fellow human being. And when you no longer see a fellow human being for what they are, it's much easier for you to line them up and shoot them in a firing squad, or to process them in a gas chamber, or any number of the atrocities that were committed by ordinary people who ordinarily would never have done something so heinous.
Hmm.
This is a tool that people like Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Hitler, used knowingly. And he, in his diary, is completely transparent about the fact that most of it's rubbish, but it's a very valuable tool, the
Hmm.
propaganda. And so, as far as the lack of empathy is concerned, I think this is just incontrovertible. I mean, yeah, I don't know what else to say about it aside from, I think this is something, if you're tempted to kind of go down the route that a lot of these anti-empathy people are going, I think you really need to sit with this and really, really think it through.
Hmm. We've quickly run out of time. It's gone quite quickly today. It's flown by. But just to leave us, we always finish on a practical note. So, what should we be doing? We've talked about, not having empathy as something to sit us up and wake us up and think about seriously, but in an effort not to dehumanize, in an effort not to or to love our fellow man and to love God as God, encourages us to, as Jesus, said were the greatest commandments. How do we do that? What can we do this week that makes us a more empathetic person?
There's a story that I think Andy Stanley, the evangelical pastor, once shared. It was an illustration. I don't know if I've shared this before on Record Live. I may have, I'm not sure. He says, if you're a parent and, you're meeting up with somebody and they treat you with respect and deference and, they're generous with you and blah, 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 but they mistreat your kids, how much worth is that respect, that deference, that generosity? He says, if you're a parent, I mean, I think any parent can say it's worth nothing. If your kids are being mistreated, you're going to hate that person. And he said that's exactly how God feels about each and every one of us. Empathy is the metric by which we show how much we love God, how much we love each other. It is impossible, I believe, to love God and to not show love for those around us, especially those who don't look like us, who don't speak like us, who don't have the same life experience as us. Just because it's harder doesn't mean it's not expected of God. And so this is for the Christians in the room. I think that if we are serious about loving God, we also have to love our neighbor. As the sheep and the goats parable illustrates, the measure by which we show our devotion to God is through how we treat those around us. And we can't treat those around us with the love of God without empathy. To be able to see each person as a fellow, son, daughter, as somebody made in the image of God, it's vital. I think it's Christianity 101. It's the gospel. And so I think the challenge for me, and I think perhaps the challenge for all of us, is who's the people in our lives that we struggle to love? Who are those that we are biased against? Perhaps it's those people that God is calling us to engage with more deeply, to build bridges with, not burn them down. It's a difficult call, but I think that's probably, if God was, wanting to challenge us, I think that's what he would challenge us with.
Thank you, Jesse, for sharing those thoughts. And a good thing to take with us this week, to see each and every other person as made in the image of God. Your piece, Is Empathy Killing the West, is available at sciencemag.com. I'm just going to put that link in the comments so you guys can read that article to find out more about what we've talked about today. Until then, Jesse, thank you for coming on. And for the rest of you, have a good week and God bless.